All right, thank you, Jen. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Monica Beta. I'm the Executive Director of the North Central New Mexico Economic Development District. And we're putting on this, I'm calling it the first run of our housing toolkit that we've been developing for the region. We have our two consultants here with us, Willa Williford of Williford LLC and Jen Lopez from Project Moxie, who will be making this presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to them. But before I do that, I wanted to thank our funder for this, the Mortgage Finance Authority. And Rebecca, I think you were finally able to get on right. Rebecca Velarde is with us with the Mortgage Finance Authority. So thank you, MFA, for funding this work. All right, Willa, I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Monica and Rebecca. So I'm Willa Williford. I'm a workforce housing consultant based in the Gunnison Valley of Colorado. And I have been working on this vexing problem of incomes being here and housing prices being here for about 20 years. And I absolutely love working on housing. I think it's challenging, it's engaging, it's so important for communities, it's so important for local economies and everyone's health and well-being. So it keeps me coming back all the time. And our scope of work that Jen and I are engaged with and supporting Monica on includes this brief series of trainings and then doing technical assistance for 4 communities within northern Mexico. And so that technical assistance piece will weave and resonate throughout this presentation, but that's kind of going forward on a parallel track to this. So I'll let Jen introduce herself and then we'll share our agenda.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jen Lopez. I'm based in Durango, Colorado, and I've been doing this housing work for about 22 years. And I know many of you, and I'm really grateful to see a lot of friendly faces. And this is, we were telling Monica earlier, we're doing a lot of these presentations. A lot of communities are in difficult spots. And so we're excited to chat with you. And thanks, Rebecca. It's nice to see you. We appreciate the partnership with MFA.
So for today's training, we're going to be talking about some context about, why we're in the position we're in with housing challenges being sort of worse than ever. We're going to talk about the best practices in community engagement, kind of what is the basic toolbox of housing resources that communities can engage. And then the second part of the training is really going to get into putting together a deal and how do you move from the idea of we need housing to construction. So we'd love to have you all introduce yourselves in the chat with your name, your agency, and the answer to this question. And I think this will help us tailor our remarks and the training a bit. When it comes to housing, what's the greatest need in your community? And so if we can see those themes that you type in, that would be a tremendous benefit. And thank you all so much for being here. We'll give everyone a few minutes and then Jen will jump into the context setting.
I'm going to keep, sharing and not sharing. Will, I'm having issues with my split screen today. So
okay.
I want to see people's faces.
Wonderful, great to see these comments coming in. Missing middle, land, multifamily. Ability for people to stay in the community.
Liz sent this to us. I mean, Susan, it's like being ran by Project Moxie. It's just like a northern New Mexico.
Oh, okay.
Housing toolkit.
Good.
Hi, Alex. There we go.
So as these comments are coming in, I'll also share, we want this to be interactive. We don't have a huge group here today, so please do raise your hand as we go, and we can, and we'll also be pausing to have Q&A. And the other thing is Jen and I work together a lot, and we'll tag team the presentation and comments in a pretty informal manner. And we'd love to have others jump in with, you know, relevant experience, questions, things that are resonating with you. I think we're at least close to having heard from everyone. Jen, how about you take it away?
All right. So we've never been here before, right? And then we always like to start with just a little bit of level setting about 2022. I mean, what a crazy year coming out of COVID. Our incomes are going up, but they're nowhere near catching up with that about 20% increase in housing overnight, right? We've got the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates. We've already got, I did this slide in January and I had 3.5% or something like that. We're already at 5.3 and growing. So it's a very challenging time right now in housing. And again, I think the national context is really important. We want to explain a little bit more, some other reasons why this is happening. So, right, COVID impacts were pretty intense, right? So we had a lot of things happening. We had folks fleeing areas because of remote working. And I know northern New Mexico has been hit by this, Santa Fe, Taos, maybe even, you know, Eagles Nest and other areas. My community of Durango was hit very hard by this. We already had a limited inventory, right? And you've got all that additional demand for it. Supply chain is the biggest conversation right now. Most of the meetings I'm having, you know, we can't get the materials. We're 6 months out. They're so expensive, right? Land is challenging. And then when we do have land, we don't have infrastructure with it. So we're either solving for one or the other. Labor issues have been a problem in the industry for years. And so it's still a challenge post-COVID. The overall market mismatch has been in play, and I bet many of your communities, again, and that's the idea that folks don't earn enough to afford housing, you know, prior to COVID, and so it's gotten a lot worse. Again, there's some other just sort of underlying challenges to the work that we try to do and why it's such a struggle right now to do any kind of below market or affordable housing, right? 75% of residential land in this country is zoned for single family. This is an old holdover from, you know, 30 years of Euclidean zoning. And essentially it's simple math. If you've got a lot that goes for 100,000 and you can only put one house on it, right? So we've got to find ways to put more units on existing lots. And you've actually got a historical precedence with this, with second homes and caretaker units and things like that. Again, regulation, we've talked about this for years, but people are, I think we're at such a desperate place. People are paying attention to regulation now. I'm hoping this is a time for some innovation. And there's a lot of things we know we could do differently. And then again, the shortage of skilled labor is continuing to be a challenge. I think, Willa, in the last 3 weeks, I've probably had 5 conversations around modular. I assume you're having similar conversations. We're trying to figure out if this is a real solution or not right now. And then, so we want to talk about in general in this workshop, how you think about housing strategy. And we're going to also talk about building housing and then how you put together a housing team. So we're trying to cover a lot of information in this session to give you a high level, view of the ways that we do housing on the ground. In housing strategy, we're looking at community engagement, knowing the data, trying to keep housing strategy very straightforward in 3 different prongs. It's all about resources, having capacity, policy, and public-private partnerships. So we'll touch on all of these things during our 2 hours together. We will also have a break about halfway through because we know this is a lot of content. What is community engagement? I'm going to stop sharing for a second because this is, hi, Matt. Matt's on. Matt, I'm having a challenge with my screens. So when I do a share screen, I can't see anybody. I can't see slide numbers. So I must have set something up. So I don't know if you could I let you do the sharing of the slides and see if that fixes it?
Yeah, of course.
See, greatest staff ever right here. For those that don't know Matt is on Project Moxie's team and does community engagement and a lot of other wonderful things for us. So thanks, Matt.
Good afternoon. No problem.
All right.
Just give me
Awesome.
one moment to get to where we're at in the presentation, and then I will start sharing.
Wonderful, but I can keep going. So, you know, in the housing space, we are sort of trained to think about community engagement a little bit more about the public realm of, you know, we're a city or a county or some kind of local government, and we are required because of the funds we use to hold meetings, right? For years and years, this was our sort of how we approached it. And I would say over the last 5 years, we've become much more aware of the need for community engagement, which looks so different, right? Community engagement is the idea that the community has a lot of knowledge, information, and you really start with engaging them first. So I'll give an example. Recently in my community, we had a huge issue with an out of area investor who came in to buy up some mobile home parks, and the community organized, and within a month we were able to find an alternative way to preserve those mobile home parks because of the organizing and the engagement with the community, right? So the kind of work that we do, the solution that we seek, it looks very different when you are working with community first. So this is just a really important part of the work when you think about overall housing strategy in the community. And then next slide, Matt. This is a chart that I inherited from some work I did with a foundation in Colorado, and I find it really helpful. And we refer to it our team a lot. And it talks about what kind of engagement you're doing, why you're doing it, what seat you are sitting in will also define what you're trying to do. So we're having a meeting in Santa Fe in a few weeks, and we are sitting on the far left of here. And it's because we're informing the community. So we've already started a project. We're not at the point yet of asking for feedback on design. So it's an information meeting. That's the purpose of the meeting. Later on, we may have meetings.
I just saw you here. I thought it.
Oh, sorry. If everyone could mute,
Oh,
that
you're
would
gonna
be
move that?
really helpful. Let's see here. Let me see if I can mute.
Okay.
Because it's not, I mean.
Matt, thanks, Matt. And then, you know, consulting is really where it's still one-way communication, but you're spending a lot of time getting feedback. In the middle is it's kind of like you still have the power, but it's deeper, it's two-way communication. And then all the way to the right is empowerment from community, right? So we just share this because every time we start a project, we want to be thinking about where we land.
And I just add in there, you know, there's some situations that call for one or another, and being really intentional about which one. I'm working on a project right now where we were deeply collaborating in community, and now the project's evolved to a place where we really need to just circle back and inform. And I think you know, that the team can use this kind of language and set yourself up for success as you head into community, because this can be this can often be the place where we're improving projects, making them better. We're debunking myths about what might be affordable or community housing, below market housing looks like. And so there's a lot, I think, you know, to map out and use these tools to strengthen your projects is, it's been very helpful for me because I started my career getting pummeled in a lot of public meetings.
I think we all did. For those that don't know it, I started my career in Santa Fe many years ago. So Matt, next slide. So again, this is just a nice diagram our team uses to be really intentional about how we're engaging, right? Conversation and how you're showing up and being open-minded, actively listening, building relationship. Language justice is becoming a huge part of our work. I'm sure it's been a part of the fabric of New Mexico for 400 years. In Colorado, it's showing up a lot in our immigrant populations. And so when we go in and do immigrant work, I've got one community where we have like over 20 languages going on during the meetings. Information sharing, right? What we share when we share is very intentional, and what we don't share can also get us into trouble, which leads right into transparency. So this is just a nice diagram reminder of how we think about this. Next slide. So where do we start? If I were starting a project tomorrow, really it's talking with the community to say, you know, what is your preferred method of engagement? what would be a comfortable, how would we get the best responses if we wanted to have conversations? Do we do them in person or virtual, right? This has been really challenging over the last 2 years. In some ways, we've gotten more engagement online, and others we've gotten not the, very different, not as robust engagement. So really talking with your client and your community. And then, we always try to do multiple channels. And so our team oftentimes will do all of the means of engagement we possibly can, right, to really increase the odds of getting the information we need. So for instance, right now we're working on a project in Durango, and we're engaging with students who are unstably housed. And so we started with the survey. We'll follow up with focus groups, things like that. Next slide. When do you begin the process? So when you think about community engagement, again, going back to that chart with, on the left, we're telling, on the right, we're following the community. Again, it depends on where you sit and what your intentions are and your role in that particular project are. But you also want to be clear about what you have to do, right? So what is required as part of the project and what is desired because of the type of project you're doing. Boy, this gets projects all the time. Be clear and consistent on your messaging. And if you're unsure, don't put it out there, honestly. So, and be very transparent about it. So for instance, we're getting ready for this meeting in Santa Fe. We're not sure yet about parking and lighting and things like that. We're just going to say, look, we haven't gotten there yet. So tell us what your concerns are so we can keep those in mind. This is really important. We've learned this multiple times. If your project's going to be contentious, and again, not all of them are, but when they are, they're usually a doozy. We found using a third-party facilitator to be a very powerful process. Next slide. And then this is just some resources we wanted to share, some different things we've used over the last few years, and these will be hyperlinks and available. Next slide.
Well, and let's pause for a second because I'm going to jump us over into data, but I was curious if anyone had any comments or questions about community engagement. I do think, I'm almost having that experience right now of like, because housing is top of the mind for us in so many ways, in so many places right now, our community engagement's been going better than it had in the past, but I feel a bit of a backlash coming. So I think that those pieces around using non-traditional methods, we like to go out and meet people at the site, do a lot of do online surveys, do postcards, do things that break down that dynamic of here's the expert or the elected official standing at the front of the room, and here are the people throwing rotten tomatoes at them. But really doing more small group work, more collaborative work to draw out what's needed. So just scanning for any comments or questions.
I think Margaret had her hand up.
Thank you, Margaret.
Really quick, and I'll let you move on. Thank you so much for the comment about hiring a third-party facilitator. I highly recommend that. I find it's really, in my experience, it takes the emotion out of everything. Both sides are very charged and invested in the process, and that's the person that really keeps it going. So I've had success with that, and I've seen that a lot in work we've done in the city of Santa Fe. And so thank you for that remark.
Thanks, Margaret.
All right, so jumping into the data, and this is an important reminder that when we're doing engagement, the data isn't the story, but the work we do needs to be grounded in data. So, I've seen too many projects miss the mark because they weren't really understanding their demographics. Who are we? What can we afford? What do we want? What do we need? So there's so many pressures in the market right now that are always pushing our projects to be priced too high, honestly, because the cost to build is so high. And yet the working members of our community, their incomes are much lower than we're usually appreciating. And so I'm always having to sort of circle my clients back to the data. So housing, and you all, many of your counties have housing needs assessments, which is a fantastic start because that gives the big picture about the trends. Is your population growing? What's happening with jobs? What's the industry mix? And then what's the housing inventory, and how do those things sort of meet or sync up together around what's needed broadly? And that's so that's typically done on a broad scale. It can be regional, county, city, et cetera, and gives you sort of the starting place for what's the overall need and what are the overall gaps in the community. And then from that, you can make policy decisions and project specific decisions about what you want to focus on. So it's important to recognize, though, that needs assessments are at this kind of higher, more general level, and that targeted market studies are usually needed for your specific project. And that is, funders will require that, and it's also just a really helpful tool in making sure that what you're proposing is aligned with the data. It's again, I see things miss the mark because we're sort of saying we need housing of any kind, and I've got several clients who are trying to convert bed and breakfasts to workforce housing, and it's kind of a mismatch, and it's really hard to do it well. So I encourage everybody to take the time to get grounded in the data as you get going, and that often a market analyst will do sort of you can have an iterative process with them before they make the fancy polished version of the market study that you're giving to your lender, your investor, your grantor way down the road. So I bring them on early. Next. And then, this is to illustrate how we have this whole spectrum of housing. And so when we're understanding the needs in our communities or the specifics of an actual parcel, where along this continuum are we working? Are we trying to hit a couple of these things and serve, sort of a couple clusters of household demographics? Are we really focused on one thing, like rental housing for seniors who have low incomes? And as those kind of decisions have a lot of impact on what resources are available to the project and also how successful it ends up being in the market.
Just a caveat here too, Willa, we both use this all the time. And what I think is interesting is when a community hires us to focus on one very narrow part of the spectrum, it's challenging, right? It's really challenging. So we just like to say, hey, yes, you need to have a focus on a project, but at all times be looking at opportunities across the continuum. And if other people want to do other parts of the continuum, let them.
Totally. And sometimes, I'm working in communities where it's been so long since something happened in housing that they want the project to be all things to all people. And that can be, I love mixed income and mixed tenure and a variety, but at each layer of complexity, this work's already hard, and each layer of complexity can introduce new risks. So I think, this is, by way of illustrating, maybe we're really just focusing on the 30 to 60% AMI rental housing. Or maybe we're doing a component of market that helps to underwrite some of the housing that's for lower income people. So we'll keep going, and we can circle back to that if we need to.
Margaret, did you have your hand up again? Oh, no. Okay. Thank you.
So starting to look at our strategies and tools, we have this training is all about the space that's below market rate housing. And there's, traditionally two different ways to go about that. And so one of them is bringing down the cost of building that housing from the get-go. And that's the nut that Jen and I are trying to crack kind of all day, every day. It's like, it's costing us this to build and we want to sell it or rent it for this. How do we make up this difference in between? And so, usually we do that with a layer cake of different strategies that we'll get into a little later. But then the other part of it is what is the ongoing, what makes it affordable ongoing? So is it okay that if we just set rents at a flat level and they increase a little bit based on the way that wages are increasing over time? Or do we need a deeper subsidy that allows households to pay 30% of their income and be, and then, then that more market rent helps to pay a mortgage and keep the property operating sustainably. So both of those, that second household subsidy approach is a lot harder to come by these days, but is still an important part of, it might be a small portion of a project, or it might be something that we're seeking because we're trying to serve people who are transitioning out of homelessness, or but it is not, I would say that, the 80% of my time is spent in the development space at this point. So when we think about a community and their strategy, we like to try to connect with that community and really understand the vision, the resources, what capacity exists now, and then really tailor what strategies are going to be effective based in that space. So I think, as we get down the road in this training with more, it's always important just to kind of like have a grain of salt over this, that it needs to be tailored to the specific political context, capacity, available partners, et cetera, of that given community. And then, I wanted to note this because we are going to be speaking largely today about development work, but there's a lot of work that can happen in the government space around incentives, regulations, and so forth that, each one of these could probably be a training on its own around, the topics of the sort of nuances of how to implement these different kinds of things that help. They don't necessarily make housing happen, but they set the table for it to be more feasible, or they bring resources to the people who are trying to make below market housing happen. And the funding column we will get into with what's available in New Mexico, and funding is a theme that runs throughout this as really vital. So I think I'll hand it to Jen now.
Awesome. So again, when we do these workshops, we're not, some of you could be experts in housing, and others, this is the first workshop you've ever done. So we want to make it as relatable as possible. So we use these bucket approaches a lot. So when we think about housing strategy, there's kind of three primary buckets that we start with. One is preserving existing housing. And this has gotten a lot more momentum over the last few years because it's so expensive to build from scratch, and we cannot replace one for one anymore, right? When we talk about preservation, we're also talking about preservation of multiple things. So mobile home parks is becoming a huge, huge issue and a huge need, and new strategies are being developed daily around that. Preserving what we call, I'm not going to say right, Willa, it's not NOAA anymore, but basically housing that's reasonably priced in your community, but that could get scooped up by investors. There's ways to preserve those units. Obviously, single family, I know in northern New Mexico, there's been rehab programs on and off for years that have been really critical. And we see rehab programs for renters as well. And then a lot of what we're going to talk about now later in this session is around promoting new development, right? And that's both rental for sale. We also will talk a little bit about special needs housing. And then at the end, what COVID has taught us probably more than anything is how do you keep people stable, right? Stably housed. And so if there's any silver lining, that's it in my mind. We are actually hopefully we'll be funding that kind of work in a more meaningful way moving forward, because we know there's a lot of our community members living on the edge, and if we can keep them from falling into homelessness, it's just better for everyone. So a lot more in that space. Next slide. So a couple like key things around promoting below market housing. So government, these are standard practices, right, can help subsidize land development or infrastructure. We see it all the time. So this is great. And with ARPA funds, we're also seeing local governments either use their ARPA funds or going to the state where there's some additional funding to acquire land or pay for infrastructure now. So very popular strategy. Local leaders can also increase development capacity through public-private partnerships for vertical. So you can have land and infrastructure, you still need to solve for who's going to build it for you. And Will and I use requests for proposals and requests for qualifications all the time to help communities vet a development partner. It's very common practice. And then again, we talk about government streamlining planning and entitlement. I was on a call this morning. We have a local modular group trying to get off the ground, and we were asking them what they needed. And they said, Jen, if you could get 3 or 4 prototypes pre-approved in the land use department, it would give us so much momentum to be able to start scaling. And I was like, yeah, that's like a no-brainer. So next slide. And Willa, just hop in because I've had my coffee. So you know me, I'm going to keep going pretty fast. Again, we talked about stability. We don't want to lose this because all of these strategies really require local, state, and federal resources typically, right? So we really need to be thinking about all of these. But when we think about stability, it's both helping existing residents stay housed. It could be a weatherization program that helps fix things in their homes so they can stay housed. It's also navigating folks to new opportunities. So that's the other piece. You can build it. It doesn't mean that your folks will come or that they can afford to buy. So as we think about building new product, we're always also thinking about how do you build that pipeline of buyers so they're ready to take advantage of that product. And then emergency assistance, right? Financial literacy, rapid rehousing, all these services-based components of a housing strategy are critical. And so we don't want to lose sight of those. Next slide. And then home ownership, you know, it's interesting. We go in and out of home ownership being the thing, and we're back in it because we can't do it, right? We really have a huge gap for most community members going well beyond, you know, what we consider moderate income. But the keys to home ownership in any community is ongoing homebuyer education, housing counseling, and then mortgage assistance. So Willa, this is the only bucket that I'm seeing grow when we think about individual subsidy. And I'm seeing a lot of employers, right, who are stepping up and launching their own mortgage funds, which is really, really helpful. Next
I
slide.
totally agree.
Yeah, do you want to add anything? Because I'm going so fast.
No, you're great.
Okay, just checking on my slides here. Awesome. And then capacity building, right? Everybody is trying to solve for capacity building right now. So here are some of the best practices we're seeing right now. Always look at what's already in place and see if it's able to expand. Sometimes it can't, and that's okay, but we always do that first. We need to be friendly with the private sector. They can scale, right? So the more that we can work with private developers to see what kinds of either offsets or bonuses or funding or incentives we can create so that they can do the product we need, the more likely we'll get more than, you know, a few units in that partnership. And then it's very common that communities just don't have local development experience. And so again, it's pretty common for us to spend time finding developers in the region that might come in, or using modular product or whatever, but we're getting pretty creative about how to fill that gap. The caveat here is, though, we're always wanting to make sure if there's local subs that they can plug into these projects. So, you know, if we can support local employment, we always will. Next slide. So defining roles, we always start here as well, where we see communities get really frustrated or stuck as if somebody's sitting in the wrong spot and trying to do the thing that would not be the most beneficial to their structure or their resource. So again, local governments are really, really pivotal right now. They develop and implement policies. They help figure out where projects can go. They typically provide funding, land, political support, those kinds of things, and very critical. Nonprofits, we see them providing direct services, but we can also see them doing direct housing development. Again, developers, for-profit, nonprofit, really are focusing on the creation of new units. They're not all created equal, and they don't all do the same kinds of things. So the kind of developer we might want to find to do a very entry-level single-family product in Taos is going to look very different than a tax credit project or a conversion, you know, somewhere else in the state. And then what's really important, and we try to help set this, it's really expectations, Willow, when folks come into the space, is we don't get to just do whatever we want. There's a lot of rules and a lot of expectations from funders, whether it's government or investors. And when you learn those rules, there's a lot of common sense to them. The rules have to do with cost containment, making sure nobody makes too much money, making sure that what you're building is something that the community wants. We talked about that market study earlier. It's really critical. But at the beginning, we want to really understand those guidelines from the funders. Next slide. Just a few more fun things that we're finding in the space that's gotten, again, silver linings around COVID. We're seeing a lot of employer engagement. So I have one employer in the Eastern Plains of Colorado that just launched a housing resource center, gave the community $250,000. I have a college in Durango that's putting up a piece of land and $1 million for mortgage assistance. You know, I multiple stories. Willa, you probably have stories too, But I think that this is one of the most untapped resources in our communities. And sometimes the employer can actually move something forward more quickly because they're in the private space. Do you want to share any stories on this one, Willa?
I would say I totally agree. You know, I think that we're seeing more employers look to us to do plans for their that might be specific to their employees, and also more employers looking to us to take a site and figure out how to do housing on it. And that is not limited to private sector employers. That also includes school districts. Right now I'm working with an electric co-op that's in the northwest part of Colorado. And often it's those essential employees that need to be in close proximity, like a water and sanitation district, where it's like, you know, they've got to have someone with a truck with the knowledge of how to repair their things. And so commute-based solutions are really falling short for them. And we're also seeing that just because every community is under housing pressure, commuting isn't a solution like it used to be between higher cost and lower cost communities.
Thanks, Willa. And the way that we've been sort of engaging employers in some of our communities is we start with a survey, we partner with the chamber, we partner with the Economic Development District, but and then it's really trying to keep up with their interest. It's just been really fascinating. Next slide, please. Here's some examples that we just talked about, right? So we're seeing them donate land or lease it. I've heard of creating housing navigator positions. So some of the universities in Colorado are having positions dedicated to finding housing for faculty and staff. Housing stipends are becoming more popular. Shared transportation, mortgage assistance, master leasing, sponsoring motel conversions. So there's probably more than that, but these are a pretty good bucket. Anything you want to add to this one, Willa? Awesome. Next slide. Public sector again. Here's the main things we're seeing in this space: repurposing underutilized assets. This is great, right? This is city and county has a building they're not using. This is land that's not being utilized. This is more and more schools, right? We have a ton of school sites because you can, instead of paying a school fee, you can donate land as a developer. So we have school sites all over the place that we're going to repurpose. And then public sector can also help identify redevelopment opportunities. So this is a picture of the Best Western, which is a motel we're converting in Durango, and the city drove that process. Creating public will is huge, right? Yes, we need this, kind of using the bully pulpit, providing cover for more activities to happen. Identifying incentives. The other thing I've seen a lot in the last year, Willa, that I didn't see throughout my whole career is because there's so much demand for development expertise, in order to sort of get people interested in working in your community, you've got to help offset some pre-development. Typically, you've got to have something that you're offering because it's too risky for developers. And so we're setting up pre-development funds in a lot of communities we work. And then funding and supporting nonprofit partners. A lot of the services in this space, yes, there's federal funds to pay for the services, but nobody pays for the staff. And so we're seeing more and more local government stepping in to kind of make sure these agencies are fully funded and can do the work they need to do, things like that. And then creating a dedicated public funding stream locally is kind of the thing right now, right? We're hearing a lot of conversation on that. Next slide.
Oh, and I'll just chime in there around, I am biased, but I really love seeing the public sector as an active driver in the housing space. We're all at the table today because the private sector hasn't been able to do this alone. And so it's, this is so vital. And I think that, just the new roles and the multifaceted ways in which public sector servants can be creative and part of the solution is tremendous. And I think that's a great laundry list you've got.
Thanks. And I apologize for using a Colorado example on this slide. Rebecca, you'll see I have a kind of placeholder slide around MFA. But what I'm trying to show on the slide is not about Colorado funding at all, but how federal funds typically show up in deals. And the point of this whole slide is that federal policy for many, many years has really focused on rental housing. And we're now starting to feel that at the local level. And so in Colorado, this was, I think, last year, 10% of the funds went to homeownership, right? Where 69% went to rental. So even though the communities across our whole, I'm going to say Southwest, because I hear the same thing, whether I'm in northern New Mexico or southern Colorado, says we need home ownership, we haven't quite shifted the funds yet to do it. And so, so because the funds aren't there, we have to be a lot more creative around home ownership. So we'll share some ideas around how we think you can get it done. Next slide. And then New Mexico resources. Rebecca, I apologize. If there's some cool chart, I want it. I will use it all the time. I didn't have a cool chart. So what I did here is I listed the key players. So obviously you always start with the Mortgage Finance Authority in Albuquerque. They have some wonderful landing pages. They have a significant amount of funding. They fund probably the biggest funder of housing in New Mexico. The Department of Finance and Administration, I don't have their web link here, but they also have some funds from American Rescue Plan Act. State legislators, I'm finding, because you all are doing so much in the state legislative spaces and things are moving quickly. They're a great resource for where you might find funds. Local governments have some funding. It's usually limited, but they, right now they do. So find out how they're going to be spending it. And then I've been a fan of Terry Bruner for years. I haven't gotten a chance to connect with him on some of this stuff, but I know they're a great resource. So Pivotal New Mexico, they're a nonprofit grant writing. Wonderful. I will, Rebecca, I don't mean to pick on you, but if there's any other resources you think we should do here, or Monica. You're still on mute, Rebecca, darn it.
Yeah, I mean, Jen, this is Monica. I think I'd like to kind of go through the whole presentation. I think we talked at the beginning of this session that we will probably do this session again a little later, particularly because our partners and our communities in San Miguel and Mora counties can't participate today in this. So we'll do a little bit of refinement, and Rebecca and I can get together and see if there's some things we should add.
Perfect. I think I'm going to kick it back to you, Willa. Does that work?
It totally works. Yeah, so I think, Jen was starting to talk about sort of the layering of the funding, and as we get into investments in housing, how we use federal, and I had mentioned this early on too, of sort of like our chronic problem in housing is like, cost this much to build and we're trying to sell or rent it for here. So, I'm a big fan of using other people's money. Other people's money always comes with strings attached. So, kind of navigating which are the acceptable things and the things that are going to knit together well. I like, certainly and I think right now we're in an abundance with recovery dollars and other, new initiatives happening at the state level, pass-through funding from ARPA, et cetera. So let's go to the next slide. And so I think this is where we're in that space that we have a parcel of land and we're ready to start putting together a development program. And so back to sort of being grounded in the data and your community engagement, taking the time to understand what's really happening. And I think, we're always enriched by having more points of view and really drawing out those themes about the true needs in the community. I love to use that process to start to cultivate a band of champions for the project. And so there's sort of a two-way street. They're helping me understand the context of what needs to happen. And I'm helping, or I'm sort of starting to get people invested and really listening and hopefully there by my side for whatever speed bumps the process might hit. I think Jen mentioned this earlier on, but like being very clear about what we know and what we don't know in how we're communicating and facilitating those conversations is really helpful. And then, also one of my favorite things starting out in a community is to have everybody share, like really take a moment and envision, if this was a success, it would look like this. And if this was a disappointment, it would look like, tell me what it would look like. And through that, then we start to tease out, okay, here are the outcomes we want. And this is something we can document. And over time, we can use it to make sure we're on our true north. Our compass is facing true north, and that we can course correct if we need to. And so I think that creates some accountability and starts to build some trust as you get your development process going. And that's, well outside the sort of normal requirements of the community meetings you might have to do a town zoning process, for example. Next slide. So I'll need to ping it back to Jen for these case studies. But I think it's always helpful to understand, some true real life examples about these more high level philosophical conversations.
Thanks, Willa. So we always talk about the fire in the belly person, and it really, there's always one person in the community who's just not going to stop until this project gets done. So this first one is Vista de Socorro, and we have this amazing partner named Marianne Chavez Lopez. She's the director of the local housing authority, and met her 5 years ago. She had a vision. She had unused vouchers. She has, she lives in a community that has a lot of really dilapidated stock. And so she was frustrated she couldn't get those vouchers out. So we talked about just building a project from scratch. They also have a really active county supportive services program, helping people stop cycling in and out of jail. And so we thought, let's stop that recidivism. Let's do a supportive housing project. They didn't have funding outside of the vouchers, and they didn't have development experience. So the solution was they hired a consultant out of Michigan, and then I got involved later to help them figure out the development process and build the team. This took a long time to do, primarily because it was a pilot. So in New Mexico, and I would say even in Colorado, it's really hard to use federal resources in rural communities. It's just a mismatch. And what other source do we have? We don't. So we went after very competitive federal sources to do the project. We got funding, and we're set to break ground this summer. Again, what was really key to this project was pre-development sources. I'm going to sound like a broken record. I'm so dependent on pre-development funding because I think things just get stuck without it. And we worked with the New Mexico Coalition to End Homelessness on that. And the total costs are about $9 million. We're working with, there is foundations, but MFA is the primary funder of this project and has been incredible to work with. So lots of kudos to MFA for their support. Next slide. This one we just, we're closing tomorrow. This is the Lamplighter, and this is a motel conversion in Santa Fe. There's been a lot of interest around motel conversions, and I really have mixed feelings now after doing 2 of them. I think they make sense sometimes. But this one made a lot of sense last year when a local coalition of stakeholders had already been meeting. They already had relationship, and they had just sponsored a motel conversion called the Santa Fe Suites that had been really successful. So they came together and said, can we do it again? And so again, the biggest challenge on this project was actually folks in the coalition didn't know their roles. So we spent about 2 months talking about who could be the developer. Oh, we don't have one, let's go get one. Who's the provider? Well, really sussing that out so that people knew how they could show up and support. The most interesting role, I think, on this project was in Quorum St. Vincent, which is a hospital foundation, was really spearheaded this project, paid for all the pre-development, actually bought the building when we couldn't do it right away because of federal rules. I mean, they've just been phenomenal. And so again, this closes this week, and we will start going through a building permit process and finishing design this summer. And again, thank you, state, county, lots of players on this one. And we really were able to take advantage of these limited ARPA funds for this. Next slide. This one is a Colorado example, but I know we're going to see some of this in New Mexico as well. So this is the group that's being funded by the local employer. Fort Morgan it's the second most diverse community in Colorado. It's where the big beef packing plants are. And so I'm working with a grassroots group of East and West Africans and Spanish speaking and all kinds of amazing people. So they had an employer who said, I want to make housing happen. The group I work for said that we want you to make housing happen for our people. Let's align and see if there's a connection here. There's a lack of new units today, but there's a huge pipeline being developed, probably 600 units in the next few years. And so what we said was, well, if we could prepare folks to buy, and we had a mortgage program, and we could work with some of these developers, we don't have to develop, right? So that's sort of the theory of change. So we developed a very easy strategy around a housing resource center, homebuyer training, education, counseling, and then my team is doing the negotiations with development partners in the city. We're launching the resource center this summer. Again, the funds came from this employer. starting new nonprofit agencies and starting resource centers is really hard until you're up and running, and then you can get some federal funds. But I thought this was kind of a fun example. Back to you, Willa.
Thanks, Ted. Yeah, before you move off of case studies, I wanted to share, well, first of all, when we do our 2.0 version of this, I hope we have pictures of all of these awesome completed projects. And then I also wanted to share one more story, which is related back to that persistent fire in the belly advocate who connects the people and the resources and the dots. So in this case, the community is Crestone in the San Luis Valley. And this amazing woman who's lived there most of her life, Akira Tenera, had observed again and again the need for affordable rental housing for seniors. And she was aware of how many seniors were living on the very, very meager means through the community work, volunteer work and food pantry and so forth in the community. And she has now, it took 3 years, but she purchased a parcel, she got architecture, she got a modular manufacturer out of Pueblo called Individual, and she's raised the money so that she will actually be able to build this free of debt. And she's anticipating rents that are $300 and $400 a month, which is, I have not seen a project with rents that low without an ongoing subsidy. And she is just my hero right now. So, and I think it was, that force of will and just completely dogged persistence that is making that one come out of the ground. And so anyway, I just wanted to chime in with that one because I thought that was an inspiring example and just a niche within these couple of case studies that would be fun to hear about.
You want me to do this one, Willa? I think we're going to keep flowing like hard talk. All right. So we just wanted to show a technical tool, right? So we do lots of interviews, we get a lay of the land, we kind of get a sense of personalities and whatnot. And then we really want to get specific in community. And so this was a tool that Mary developed, Willa, on a project we're working on here. And I love this tool. So we'll interview the city or the county. Do you have a housing fund? Yes or no? All of these things. And through those interviews, now we have this nice spreadsheet that can explain across the community what's happening. We find over and over again that communities don't even know what's already happening, right? So you got to start with just kind of capturing what's happening and then build off that into what people are thinking about, and then finding those connections so things actually get done. So I like that little strategy doc. Next slide, Matt. And then keeping in mind, again, we said this before, for sale housing is the hardest to do because of rising construction and lack of public subsidy and land. It's Willa says cake, I say enchilada, but it's basically how do you subsidize at every single layer? So can you subsidize the land? Can you subsidize the infrastructure? And I think we have a slide on this as well. And then key strategies include, oh, there it is, land, modular, etc. We talked about having that pipeline of buyers. Again, I'm in communities talking about alternative types, Will, and I wonder if you're seeing this too, where they're like, I'm going to do a 400 unit micro thing, or I'm going to do this. And I'm like, that's fine, but show me that there's demand for it. Because again, it doesn't always align. I also see modular coming into communities where there's a cultural mismatch. So for rental projects, we usually use cross-cutting, right?
Would you say more about the cultural mismatch? Just explain.
Yeah, we have in one of my communities, a product was developed and we shared it with the community, and they were like, we would never live in that. Like, right. So the design, nothing was really felt like it was locally informed. So, and then rental projects, again, if you remember that 10% for home owners and then almost 70%, for rental. Well, great, we have all this money for rental housing, but it's really, really complicated to use. So we typically see that we have to, find the developers that have that expertise because the federal regulations are so complex. I think it's back to you, or we're going to take a break. It might be a break. Okay.
Yeah, this brings us to a break, but I think, before we take a few minutes, I would love to just circle up with any questions, discussion. And we are right on time. So thank you for hanging in there with us. And what comes to mind for you as we've talked about these components of your housing toolbox?
Can anybody hear me? No?
We can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay, good. My IT person was helping me fix it. So I'm here, Rebecca. Sorry about that.
Wonderful. Thanks.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Did you want to weigh in with any of the MFA tools? I know we're
No, I
actually
think you
going to
guys
do
did a great
a training
Yeah.
that is dedicated to that. But I think, especially in that pre-development space, if there's just anything that you want to make sure this group had on their radar.
I don't have anything to add right now, but I'm enjoying this. And I think you guys are doing a great job.
Thank you. All right, well, seeing no other comments or questions, why don't we reconvene at 4:05? We're going to give you 7 minutes. See you soon. All right, we're back.
I gotta go, okay?
Thank you all. I will kick off our next section on the affordable housing development process. So as you've already started to glean, this work is not for the faint of heart. With the amount of sort of complexity and risk and moving parts. And this is part of why I love the work, but it's also, people need to be very cross-disciplinary as they, I sort of think real estate development in the market space is hard and has a lot of risks and challenges. It's sort of notorious for its boom bust qualities. And in the below market space, there's just that another layer of complexity and challenge. So, I think that sort of steeling ourselves for that and being eyes wide open is a real is a good sort of foundational starting place. And then, to Jen's point about like having a lot of partners and players, because together we move things forward through our collaborations, but being really clear on who's in what role and how decisions are being made. And so, nobody can do this work in isolation, but we can also get bogged down when things are unclear or there's kind of turf wars. So next slide. I love this one because it looks like the inside of my brain sometimes, just like it's so not linear. But what I think it highlights is that, all these different disciplines of the data, the human relationships, the construction industry and expertise, the financing, all need to be iterative and informing one another as we go throughout the process. Because I just had this experience with a client recently where he was showing me this gorgeous site plan that they'd invested they have a town-owned parcel, they invested a ton of money on a beautiful plan, but they were using a financial model that's really about 15 years old. And I was like, I'm going to break his heart, but that doesn't pencil anymore. So, failing to have an interdisciplinary team kind of set him up for a big fall. But I'm sure we'll call it a comeback. We just need to think about it a little differently. So, we've to date in this presentation spent a lot of time on the first two, what I would call the first two phases of development. That sort of, we've got an idea, we've got a piece of land, we want to think about how we're going to, what our goals would be, how we'd be successful, starting to dip our toe into sort of feasibility around what kind of funding sources we could use, how are we going to get this built. Once we've kind of checked some of those boxes on those two things, we can start to get into the deal making of who are the partnerships and how are they aligned and how do we start to document that around memorandums of understanding and contracts and development agreements. And then, usually there's sort of this big moment in our world where we have a financial closing, and that signals that huge milestone between deal making and construction. And then, once we do that financial close, on paper, we have everything dialed. We've got our architecture, we've got how this project's gonna operate financially, who's responsible for what, how all the different layers of the enchilada come in. And we have an actual construction loan that we can start drawing against and paying those contractors who are actually building this. And I'll say that these first three phases usually take about 2/3 of the time. I don't know if you'd agree with that math, Jen, but it takes so long to get everything in place. And then actually, once you close, to me, it's off to the races. And then that's when it starts to feel like it really comes together quickly. And then, once you complete construction, you have your certificate of occupancy, then you're into either your lease up or your sales process. And this can be a long-term commitment if the community is managing that property themselves, or if they're placing deed restrictions on it that need some compliance over time, or if you're in the community land trust space. So next slide. So getting into that concept phase, this is where that a Kia fire in the belly person is so vital, because this is the phase where it's probably, at least half the projects stall out. It's like they just never get into, they never get past that idea. But this, and this is actually one of my favorite places to work, because you're helping sort of the dreams and the constraints find some harmony together. So, putting in place, who are we going to serve and why, and is that grounded in the data? And then how are we going to fund it? And I certainly work with many people who start just strictly from a pro forma point of view. I like to try to be more iterative with the site constraints and the community hopes and dreams, because I think, when we get into purely financially driven projects, then we tend to lose what's unique to that community, and we get things that feel more cookie cutter. Not that, it isn't an important way to produce housing, but it's just that's not what kind of gets me up in the morning. Next. So financial feasibility will, of course, iterate throughout your entire process, because I've never had a project that got to its financial close and was exactly the same at the end. But it is, and this is a space where I feel like anyone can learn it, but having some financial acumen and some technical expertise is very, very helpful. And starting to align those funding sources, are we going to go after tax credits? What kinds of local banks might participate? Who are the other soft sources that will help us get there? Who's willing to take risk? I mean, nothing makes me more happy than a funder who is willing to be the first money into a project. And I think Jen has a real knack with finding that resource. So together we'll go places. All right, and I think I would also just like to highlight in this one about this kind of important question around, can your project support debt? As we're working in small and rural communities and places where incomes are quite low, being realistic that debt, like a long-term loan, may not be something, we may just need the rents of our property to cover our operating expenses. And if we're, that open, often, if we're looking for a long-term mortgage to cover 30 or 50 or 70% of our project costs, and we realize we can't do that, we've opened up a much bigger gap and a much more challenging financial puzzle to complete. But I think it's good to be real, just be real holistic upfront about that, and then it becomes the task of attracting money to a good idea that will serve the community. Next. So, this is where the wet blankets come in the feasibility phase. It's like, oh yeah, you've got a performer that works, but you didn't think about the foundation assembly that you're going to need because you have expansive soils, or gosh, well, you could totally make this work if you could charge $1,000 a month for rent, but really your market demographics are telling us you need to be at $700 a month. And so each one of those this usually, all roads lead back to our financial pro forma, usually in the feasibility phase. Oh, we didn't get the parking variance we wanted, and so now we're losing 2 units, and each financial or each feasibility speed bump, usually takes creativity and resources to overcome and gets us that much closer to, I kind of think of this as like debugging or de-risking the project to get to that place where we're all in agreement. This is this is a green light, and we can make that financial closing.
Willa, when I'm working on a project with a team that's new to development, I say this is going to die multiple times, and they're like, "What?" I'm like, "Just watch," and it does, right? And every time something happens, you're like, "We can't come back from this." And we like to tell people this because it's painful if you don't know that that's just what happens. And then,
Yeah,
so.
like the drama of it can be exhausting. And, I think I had a joke with one of my colleagues when I was working in a large housing authority of like, oh, don't even talk to me if the gap is less than $1 million. Like, it's like, okay, let's, next slide. So physical feasibility, and I love this picture because this is so often we're all just like standing there scratching our heads. So are we going to be able to do what we hope to do with the site we have? I think, again, I had this experience in my own town, Crested Butte, where our whole team, which included 3 town employees, felt like we could fit an awesome 70-unit apartment and townhouse kind of thing on this nice 2-acre site they had. And we got like 6 weeks into our planning, and someone just read our design guidelines more carefully and realized that we had not really understood our zoning, and we lost 20 units. And it was completely codified in an annexation agreement that could not be changed, and we were stuck with that huge hit. Again, just back to debugging and having a lot of brains in the room and really carefully digging through the layers of all the things that constrain a site. And again, yeah, this is we're going to have several deaths on the physical feasibility bed too. I do like to just highlight though, when we're starting to deal with very large offsite infrastructure, I usually get into a place of I'm just going to walk away. So, I mean, one of the very early kind of checklist things is do we have water and sewer that can serve this site? Because extending those within a site, yes, we're going to be able to solve that. But if we're talking about we don't have capacity in the system, or we need to extend it a significant amount of, across other land or down the street or something, it starts to get real hairy. Jen, what would you weigh in on here?
Yeah, I come up against this a lot in my rural work because folks just are a little more flexible on sites that could be used, right? And so what I typically end up saying is, this makes sense to me and you, but it may not make sense to the primary funder. So we have 2 choices here. We either need to convince them or we need to walk away, because again, we have our own gut check. Does this work or not? The funder in Albuquerque or in DC or whatever may just kibosh it. So kind of bringing back that funder piece again of what do they expect in terms of the feasibility on the site.
Yeah, I think that's great. Because I had a client who a rural county, and they had a beautiful 13-acre site, and they're like, we're going to do on-site, we're going to do 200 units, and we're going to do on-site wastewater treatment. And I'm like, okay, well, let's run that to ground. And we interviewed a dozen developers, and none of them had ever done that before. And the path to get through our state public health agency turned out to be extremely expensive and risky. And so we needed to figure something else out, and we did. But yeah, I think that's a good. And I'm also curious, Jen, if you want to speak to the equity considerations here.
Yeah, our team learned a lot about siting based on equity considerations when we were doing basically managed camps in Denver during COVID. And sort of what we learned here is that oftentimes, right, housing goes places where there's already concentration of folks who are low income. And so we talk about communities of opportunity and just mixed income, all of these concepts that the more we mix our communities, the better off everybody is. And so the way that this shows up in our work is if we have not picked a site yet and we're working with a very specific population, we'll ask them, where do you think we should try to find a site? Where would you like to be? And before we even go out and look at sites. So that's that equity piece of making sure that we're not isolating people or concentrating people.
Thank you. All right, let's talk about financial feasibility in a little bit more detail. So, I think that and when I talk about the pro forma, usually it has these 3 layers in it around how are we doing that phase that's from the financial closing to our certificate of occupancy. That's the capital phase. Then how is it going to operate for its duration? Are we confident that it's sound from we're going to collect these rents, we're going to have these expenses, and we're going to be in the black and pay our mortgage if we have one, and we're going to be in the black. And so we like to run that out 15, 20, 30 years and make sure that using some sort of reasonable assumptions we're gonna, that it's gonna operate as, or if it needs ongoing subsidies, that we're eyes wide open about that and we have a plan for it. And I think, I spent some time in my career on workouts, projects that hadn't gone to plan. And it was very interesting work, but almost always it's sort of basic, but like they went sideways because we thought we'd get higher rents and we thought our operating expenses would be lower. Like that's, or both. And so I think, that's where when Jen's talking about our funders in Albuquerque or DC or whatever, they're very attentive to this because, they don't want to be left high and dry if things go sideways. And then I think, the services budget may or may not be part of the picture depending on what type of housing you're doing. But if it is serving low or very low income people, it's people will realize more success if there's a service integration component, and Jen will talk more about that later. The financial, this part, again, super iterative, but we're looking at the project sort of in isolation with these three things of like, let's solve the building phase, let's solve the operating phase, and let's solve the services phase. And there's little ways that they can be linked together. But mostly we're really like looking at those as their own, each its own thing. I think that we, there's a point in these projects where we want to get lawyers involved and really make sure that we're setting up the ownership in the smartest and best ways that that isolate risk and will be work for those back end funders and investors. But we don't have to probably get into that until we're getting somewhat close to our financial closing. So Jen, do you want to speak to this one?
Yeah, this is you said the public sector is showing up, and it's so exciting, and I couldn't agree more. And sort of where I'm seeing them show up is this gap at the beginning, right? So like I'm going to use our motel conversion here in Durango. We didn't have an entity that could even make an offer, right, and tie up the real estate. So feasibility is like, who can do we have an entity that can acquire? Do we have an entity that can fund the pre-development work? And then, where's that pre-development funding going to come from? And then we're also, even early on thinking about timing is everything at the very beginning. And I'm so grateful. I learned so much in the last 2 years with all the federal funds. And I was like, oh, I'll just weave them all together. Well, you can do that, but it really is complicated. And so when I start a project from scratch now, I'm paying a lot of attention to timelines and federal requirements. And but yeah, feasibility, in order for my community, my local government to even want to put in an offer on the motel, I had to run numbers. I had to say, look, I think this is what would happen, right? So there's a lot of sort of, I don't want to say guesses, they're educated guesses, but we're taking risk. There is real risk at the beginning. And so I think the more you can think about in your local community, how can you help mitigate that risk? It's more likely you can move forward on a project. Next slide.
So this is the construction phase, and this is really where the rubber hits the road. And I feel like we put so much time and vision and energy and money into getting to our construction close and being ready, getting into the ground. But there's still a huge amount that can go wrong here. And I have just up the street from me in Mount Crested Butte, I have a great example, which is a halfway built affordable housing development that's got Tyvek flapping in the winds and snow on a bunch of lumber. And it just makes me cringe every time I go by it because, and I think there's a bunch of things that went wrong, but it was, the town did not use a rigorous selection criteria. So they didn't do a competitive process to find a developer. They kind of did a handshake. They did not do a rigorous vetting of contracts and documents. And then this was a builder out of Oklahoma who like, I love the Gunnison Valley. I'm great at building in Oklahoma. I got you. And COVID hit and he was just crickets. He was gone. So, I think that this is where, again, where those dollars spent on attorneys and thinking through roles and where the buck stops. Often we're midway through construction and we have some problem we have to solve, and it's like who's coming to the table with what resources, and how do we make those decisions really quickly, so we're not just spending more interest on our construction loan or bogging down our other trades that are waiting to get onto the site. If the public sector has a lot of skin in the game, it's super important for them to have the right role during construction, which is not obstreperous. It's solutions, problem solving oriented, but also pretty hands-on, so that they can see if something is starting to go sideways and get involved. I think that the example I gave in Mount Crested Butte, if there had been someone from the town walking the site on a weekly basis, we wouldn't be where we are today. So yeah, any other words of wisdom on construction, Jen? And then you finally, we didn't even do like the grand opening. You get to finally have a ribbon cutting and a celebration, and like the best moment of all when people move in and it's their home. So yeah, there is light at the end of the tunnel.
So this is a great pause, right? So we've got maybe 15 more slides. We've got quite a bit more content, but I think we could stop right now, Willa, and see if there's questions, because we just covered a lot of things. If there are questions, yeah, and we could even just take questions for the next 15 minutes if things, people had feedback. I think the best way to think about it is either raise your hand or you can throw a question in the chat. Simone?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a developer in Taos, and I'm new to Taos. I was developing in Florida, which is a different market than Taos. And so I wanted to find out more about what you all think about the pre-development phase. You're mentioning a phase that affects me a lot, and a reason why I'm more, I haven't really been doing affordable housing because of that pre-development cost. What resources does New Mexico specifically have that I can, connect with people about in order to start thinking about these types of projects?
It's a great question, Simone. So I'm going to share the resources I've gotten access to, and then I might ask Rebecca if she wants to comment. I've been primarily finding pre-development through grants. So there's some pretty active foundations in northern New Mexico that are starting to fund more pre-development work. So we could certainly, help you connect to them. We also see with ARPA funds, local governments are starting to fund pre-development because they recognize that that's how they can really sponsor something moving forward. Sometimes we'll find an employer that's interested in partnering, and they're willing to pay for some of the pre-development. So those are the sort of non-government sources that I usually tap into. Monica or Rebecca, does MFA have any formal pre-development? I don't think so, right?
No, we don't have any formal pre-development programs, mostly because ours are public funds usually, and public funds are tied to unit production. And when you're talking pre-development costs, you can't guarantee that the units will be produced. I don't know if Monica has anything to add.
No, not really, but I think that some of the planning sources, there's some money for plans but these would only be available to like local governments. Money for planning through the finance authority potentially could be used for maybe some type of technical assistance around housing. So those are the only things that I can think of that you didn't mention, Jen.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I totally relate to your dilemma because those pre-development dollars are at risk and those carry costs are long, if we're looking at 2 or 3 years to get to in the ground.
Right.
There was an example of a project here in Gunnison that the city actually, they did an RFP for a developer. They had a town-owned parcel, and they did an RFP for a developer, selected a developer, and he was a local, awesome guy who really got the community and they knew he could execute. And through their agreements with him, the city funded pre-development up until he was at construction start. So that was just a way, and I know not every city is willing to do this, and Taos may not be in that bucket, but they had some level of confidence with him. They had a plan if the project wasn't feasible, or they didn't get there, but they funded that couple of years to get through, because it had to do a PUD and they had to build some streets, and there was quite a bit that had to happen. And it made the project work, because I mean, he just was, it would not have, adding that carry cost would have completely eroded the affordability.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll look into that. Thank you. Thank you all.
And Simone,
Yeah,
I can say,
thank you. That's exciting that you're working in that space in Taos.
Simone, I think we'll have answers to that question in Taos in maybe 6 to 8 weeks. So I know we're in early conversations with the city or town and county on potential pre-development sources. So just keep touching base with them.
Okay, I definitely will. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah,
You want,
Monica.
Monica?
I'm gonna ask, what were the slides that were next to the deck that you all were gonna finish up with? Or what did they cover?
Yeah, we have two different directions we could go here, because we have a block about putting together a successful team. And then we also have some like a section on affordable housing types, and sort of breaking down a few of those typologies within that housing spectrum, sort of the high points of those. What would be the group's pleasure? And maybe you could just either speak up or put it in the chat.
Well, I hesitate to speak for people, but I will, since nobody's speaking. So I think maybe the housing types would be helpful for people to understand. And I think I know what you're going to present. So I think that might be a helpful place to go.
Let's jump into that then. And yeah, thank you, Matt.
And everybody just jump in if you have questions. I don't want everyone to just be listening if you have, things you want to ask, but I also want to make sure that we present some of the information that you all have asked for. So,
yeah. All right, so Jen and I will just take turns here with the different typologies we have. So I'll start with a single family home ownership. And so, I mean, I think everyone's pretty familiar with this, but I would also just caveat it to say, this is not limited to a home with 4 walls and a little yard around it. This could be duplexes, it could be townhouses, it could be condos, and more I'm really seeing and encouraging communities to embrace those attached but still owned types of housing. So I think this is when we survey people in community, this is most often what they want from their housing, is to own it and to build wealth. And so I think it's a really important part of our culture and people's hopes and dreams, and very effective in providing housing stability, provided we're not over leveraging people with what their mortgage payment is. So, the major problem in this space at this point is that the delta, and I'm just coming back to this again and again in this presentation, but the delta between what it's costing to build and what it is costing, what people can afford to pay, is so great. Sometimes it's more than the cost of the home itself. So I'm working on a project in Steamboat right now where we're looking at the cost to build being around about $750,000 for a home. And we want to sell them for $250,000, $300,000. That's about what local wages would indicate would be appropriate. So it's pretty daunting. It is the other thing, which is not represented on this slide, but I think is a major consideration / challenge in this space, is finding the right balance between that wealth building piece and the substantial amount of investment it's going to take to make a home like this happen, and preserving that as something that other members of the community have access to in the future. So do you do a deed restriction? Do you use a land trust? How do you ensure that you're not just granting a major windfall of public and private dollars to a single person or a single household? Now, of course, the market is creating these windfalls all the time. So it's a frustrating space, but it's, I think that's something, to grapple with if you're really thinking about going down the homeownership track. I'm also seeing that homeownership is often having a portion, if you have a larger site, having a portion of the project that has homeownership can really help the community have buy-in for the housing overall. So a lot of projects I'm working on now have maybe 60 or 70% rental, and then the delta is ownership. And bringing on a small scale developer who's from within the community, who's mission driven, can be huge, whether that's like a Habitat for Humanity affiliate or a nonprofit, or just a really mission driven developer individual in the community. And so, I think that I see funders struggling with this because for so long we sort of felt that in the below market space, or for sale housing was kind of taking care of itself. Well, it's not. It's really, and this is why we have this tremendous missing middle dynamic in all of our communities. It's like people can't jump from renting to buying their first home anymore. The prices have gotten beyond what was possible. So there's one other note here about it's hard to make fees with this model, just because it is so unprofitable right now. So if I haven't thoroughly discouraged you, I do think that the payoff is big here in terms of people investing in their community, putting down roots, being able, oftentimes with new or below market neighborhoods, it enables people to start a family, just having that housing stability. So it's very worthwhile work, again, hard to do. You're probably sensing a theme. Jen, I'll hand it to you for multifamily.
So again, this is hard, but not as hard. And this is why I think you see so much more activity with this, right? So providing high quality rental housing for low income and workforce in the community, 15 to 45,000 a year. We can go higher in this, but we wouldn't use a tax credit model. The challenge though is we still underfund everything in housing, right? And this is a whole federal policy piece that we could do on a different day, but so the funds are extremely competitive. It takes years to get the funds, right? So we can't really scale this as a solution, right? It's kind of like the Willy Wonka, you won the ticket conversation. We build one building and it's oversubscribed, but we still do it because we need to. It works best when there's so this is my passion and my pet peeve and one comment. It's such a valuable resource. And I think New Mexico is a model for this, in that you give points and you really emphasize a nonprofit partner or a nonprofit in the ownership structure. Colorado doesn't do this, and that's so critical, right? So why is that critical? Because these funds come in and it's a lot of funding and it builds a beautiful building. But if you don't have that nonprofit or local piece attached to the project, it goes to a private developer and the local community loses the opportunity to control an asset. And so that's sort of the niche thing here. The other thing around local communities, I think you have a lot of power with the tax credit program, because the state agencies want to know that you support the project. And I think you miss an opportunity to negotiate certain things when those developments come to your community. So we spend a lot of time setting communities up to have more control over this resource, even if they're not the developer. The sponsor consideration, a sponsor again, this is part of the slides we skipped. So I'm going to define what a sponsor is. The sponsor is the entity, can be public sector, private sector. It's the entity that says, I'm going to make a project happen by either providing funding or land or something to initiate the process. And so, so sponsors in the tax credit space can actually, earn fees and have a piece of that resource that's coming to the community. So it's a powerful tool. Next slide. Back to you, Willa.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is sort of moving left on the housing continuum, really addressing people who are not stably housed, but need a resource to kind of, for a short period of time, that's very supportive and has services, but the intent is that they'll be participating in the housing market in a way out beyond. So it's between permanent supportive housing and affordable rental housing on that spectrum. And it's the idea that, with sort of having housing and stabilizing and growing your income and these types of things then is a temporary state. And I think it's a really worthwhile model, especially as we're just seeing housing prices getting away from a lot of people and this space opening up where it's like households are experiencing housing instability who are otherwise fairly stable in their lives. And so it's great mission-driven work. It is, I'm often seeing it done in sort of collaborative settings of different nonprofits, sharing resources, kind of referring people. It fell out of favor for a while because there was sort of like, well, transition to where? Like, why are we asking you to move on? But I think that there's very much a place for it. And there's other model, you can do it in a way as well where it's, it doesn't have to be a site-specific thing. It can be scattered throughout the community or a few units within a larger multifamily project, because it can be challenging to fund.
Next slide. All right. So permanent supportive housing is, again, farthest to the left, chronically homeless. We've seen an uptick in homelessness in most of our communities. This is a best practice. It's very effective when done to fidelity, but it's also a very expensive model. I was just sharing with the community this morning that wants to do a supportive housing project, and what I asked them was, what's your data say? I think we don't always think about how let me say it a different way. If there's 50 people experiencing homelessness in a room, only 25% of those folks really need this intervention, because this intervention provides an affordable apartment with a rental subsidy with massive supportive services. And so again, it's a best practice, but we want to make sure that if we're building this kind of a model, that we're putting the right people in the building that need the help. Where we see communities kind of go south on this model is they don't have dedicated services funding. So you put people in and they fall right back out. Or they put people in who don't need the services. And so it's a mismatch around resources. New Mexico has been doing more supportive housing funding. This is primarily funded by the state in partnership with local housing authorities. And we usually use a tax credit to do this. I think there's one project in Albuquerque that was able to do it without tax credits, but this is a definite type. Rebecca, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so just so everybody knows, we did get Home American Rescue Plan Act funds, and I think about 7 million of those funds we're going to be releasing an RFP for permanent capital for permanent supportive housing. Additionally, we do expect to allocate some American Rescue Plan Act fiscal recovery, coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds too. So that RFP and the allocation from ARPA FRF is going to go to our board this month. So I expect that RFP to be released soon.
That's always great news. Thank you. Next slide. Back to you, Willa.
Excellent. So, this has been, as we started to do some of our community outreach that we mentioned, was a parallel track of this technical assistance contract. The need for housing rehab programs has surfaced several times, and I see this across all the mountain communities where I work, that most of our housing inventory is older, whether that's 100+ years older because it was a mining cabin or a little stucco home, or even if it was just built in like the 70s or 80s. There's things are beyond their useful life, and they need recapitalization, and people are experiencing housing instability through the lack of housing quality. So housing rehab programs, I think are important to just kind of keep in mind that we need to take care of the inventory we already have as well as building new. And I think that it's, having a consistent program is helpful. Combining it with some of the federal weatherization work that happens can be really good, because then if you're making a home more energy efficient and dealing with other things that might be needed for renovation, you're furthering how affordable it is to live in the home, how safe it is, and kind of really getting it back to a place that's where it's going to last for a long time. So, and I would just say ancillary to this, several communities have expressed interest in programs that bring abandoned homes back into habitability. And so that is the farthest end of sort of the rehab spectrum, and a consideration, for this region that I think would be phenomenal. And some communities are already down the road with it, but I think having more capacity and funding in that space would be tremendous.
I'm going to take it home really quickly. I'm going to do that. So we just gave you all this information. And so if you're sitting there and you're saying, well, this is all really nice, where do I start? We just want to leave you with a few questions and where to start if you're starting with a project from scratch. So again, it almost always starts with, who do you want to serve? Who you want to serve is going to drive location, housing type, right? All of those things. What are the issues or needs that your program participants have? What are you trying to solve for? So you might be working in a rural community where it really is about the quality of their existing home, right? And then how is your community documenting the need? Every funder is going to ask you for this, and then you're trying to align what you're hearing and what you have on paper, and so that you can tell a compelling story to the funder. And then have you looked at market demand? I have this conversation maybe 4 times a week where somebody calls me and says, I've got 12 lots and I'm going to do X. And I'm like, who's going to buy it or who's going to rent it? Have you checked? And so again, this kind of gut check, is there demand for that particular product? And I think it's hard for people to get their head around it. Like, well, there's no housing. Well, people will drive for a 1,200 square foot house that's priced the same as your 500 square foot micro home, right? So these are right. This is rural realities. People will drive for bigger homes typically. So we want to be really sensitive to local markets. Next slide. And then, so you want to serve this population, you feel comfortable about what they need and what they want, then you're kind of moving into, so what's that size and unit mix going to look like? Is it single family or multifamily, rent for sale, right? So when we do longer term trainings, I have a project concept form, and I just walk people through it until they can answer those questions. Oftentimes it's months, right? So you put together like a dream team locally, folks who want to do something about it, and you just keep walking through these questions until you have more clarity. So we're going to be putting together some materials for Monica's team, some different examples of RFPs and documents that will help folks move to the next level on their projects. And so, yeah, I think I'll stop talking. Willa, do you have anything else you'd like to share?
I think we're there. Well, we did, I guess we were gonna, I think we've covered the technical assistance piece. So, yeah, that brings us to the end. We have, Monica, these slides and the recording will be available on Monica's website. I believe there will be, this future training on financing, as well as maybe revisiting this 101. And we would, love to entertain any further questions or aha moments for people, or, if you're scratching your head about anything, we're here and would love to have a dialogue.
And I was just going to add, if in those comments that you all provide back to Willa and Jen right now, or questions, if there's anything that you wanted us to get deeper into that we didn't cover, if you guys could note that as well, that would be helpful for the next, how we structure either the 2.0 of this or a future training on a more specific topic.
Thank you. Yeah, good idea. And Monica, can you share how people can be informed about upcoming trainings and future opportunities?
I think we had a registration through this. So let me just put my my information in the chat. You can email me, but we did a registration for this so that we would have everybody's emails and we could keep you on the list for future events. So I'll go ahead and put my information here as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, we'll do a last call. Like we're getting towards 5 o'clock and it's probably time to call it a wrap. So thank you all so much. We really appreciate seeing your faces and getting the chance to talk with you about this. And we look forward to the next one.
Have a great
Thank
night,
you, everybody.
Thank you.
Want to hit the record button?